Hi friends, hope you're fine today. So today I wanted to talk about SBS and SBS Australia. So that's a special broadcasting service in Australia. And I wanted to talk about them because yesterday evening I went to an event which was supposed to be an SBS event, which was to gather information. It was like a community consultation in Hobart, and it was held at the Moona Arts Centre. And it was 21st of June 2018. And so I went to this event, and I didn't expect much, I have to say, because I include SBS as part of the corporate mainstream media. SBS is funded by the government, and there's also, I think they're funded by some other sources, but they're government funded, and so that immediately can compromise a news service, particularly when the government at this present time is a conservative government, quite right wing really. So, but anyway, I went along, and because we were going to bring up some issues about gender diversity, because it's a community consultation, and they stressed how much they wanted to find out from the from the community, what the community feels they should be sort of producing and talking about, etc. So anyway, we went along for that, but I was going to ask a question when they got to the question and answer section about their reporting of news on their nightly news. And but anyway, so there was quite a few people there. I don't know, there might have been 100 or more in the audience, and there was some diversity there, which was good. And they had about 5 or 6 staff people there, and they had the news presenter there. I keep forgetting her name. I don't know why, but anyway, she was there. And anyhow, the evening, unfortunately, was a lot of just self-promotion on the part of SBS. It was probably about an hour or more of them just sort of showing us what they do, as in the programs they have. And I felt a little bit duped, because I sort of thought that they would spend a lot more time in some ways finding out from the audience what would be good things to talk about and to present. But instead it was sort of like, I felt like a captive audience being sort of shown how good SBS is in all the different programs. Now, I'm not saying that SBS doesn't provide valuable services to the Australian public, because they do. They have lots of different educational programs, and they have great language services, and the NITV, it's an Indigenous channel that's 24 hours, which is great. There's a lot of really good things about SBS, but my interest lies in, and of course they focus on asylum seekers and the plight of asylum seekers. And my partner asked, in the question and answer section, she asked about, there's often in Australia, there's often this discussion about asylum seekers, but there is no discussion about how these asylum seekers and refugees came to be. It's like they're coming out of a vacuum, or it's like their countries are just inexplicably dysfunctional and violent, and so they need to come to the West, because we're so good with human rights and everything, haha. that, they need to come to the West and, we need to help them, this white man's burden thing. Not that they put that out there. I'm not saying SBS put that sort of thing out there, but there's this sort of a complete absence of a sort of discussion about how these refugees and asylum seekers came to be. And I've said, I said in my last live stream, that, we in the West, Western imperialism has destroyed a lot of countries and continues to do so and continues to meddle. The US empire continues to meddle in lots of countries and does quote unquote regime change, and has been doing that since the CIA was formed. It meddled in 81 different countries, attempted to overthrow or has overthrown mostly democratic elected governments in these 81 countries, and that's been between 1946 and 2000, and that is something. And it's going on unabated. I could mention a whole bunch of other countries that they've been meddling in since 2000, and a lot more, and have destroyed. And anyway, so the U.S. empire. If anybody pays attention and actually looks at independent journalism. It's very clear that the U.S. is at the epicenter of a lot of this unrest, a lot of the violence, a lot of the destruction of all these Middle Eastern countries, and has even funded, and this is sort of, they've actually funded, sort of terrorist groups. That's, sort of something that they've done. I mean, to the point where one of their Congress members, Tulsi Gabbard, tried to introduce a bill saying that it's illegal for the U.S. to fund terrorist groups. I mean, that's how much it's a real thing. And and so anyway, so this sort of lack of acknowledgement, and they that in their news programs of the U.S.'s central part in a lot of the terrible destruction in the Middle East. I mean, I don't really watch mainstream news because I find it just so, it infuriates me, because it's usually just establishment sort of, it's establishment propaganda, really. That's what I find it, just to be perfectly frank with you. And so I have a lot of trouble sort of, I just find it a waste of time. But anyway, when my partner sort of did sort of say, that, there's never really any focus, on how these asylum seekers and refugees happen to, came into existence. And anyway, and so the head of the news sort of thing there, not the presenter of news, but the head of the department of news or whatever, he sort of explained away and said, oh, well, we have Dateline. Well, when people watch Dateline, they're probably already, to some degree, politically nousy about things, or maybe not, but they're already looking for detailed information or whatever about this. But a lot of people don't watch Dateline. A lot of people, watch, unfortunately, the nightly news. They watch that to get the news. I wish they didn't, but they do. And so when, for example, the presenter, when SBS News Australia talks about Yemen, like I actually added to my partner's question, I said, when she mentioned, that the Iran and there was another country and Saudi Arabia were involved in this sort of violence in Yemen, and she left out the US, and I thought that was very telling. So I sort of followed up and said, the US, to her, to the presenter, I said, the US is directly involved and this is factual, right? This isn't conspiratorial, directly involved in the genocide, and it is a genocide. You can actually state all what are the markers of a genocide, and it fits all of that, right? So I said, the U.S. is directly involved in the genocide in Yemen, and it's refueling planes. There's Marines on the ground. They're in the cockpits, with the Saudi pilots who and helping them get to targets. They're directly involved, and they're also funding it. They're giving hundreds of billions of dollars, not giving, but selling hundreds of billions of dollars to Saudi Arabia for this genocide. And it is a genocide. They're bombing hospitals and infrastructure. They bombed the port of Hodeidah, which has 80% of Yemen's food coming through the port of Hodeidah. So there's been a terrible carnage so far, with one child every 10 minutes dying of famine and disease in Yemen. And this is a direct result of the US and Saudi, bombing campaign of infrastructure and hospitals, including Médecins Sans Frontières hospital, which was a cholera hospital specifically built for the outbreak of cholera, which has claimed a lot of lives. There's tens of thousands of people so far have died, many children. And as I said, one child every 10 minutes is dying of famine and cholera and other diseases. So this is what the US is directly participating in. And this is about reinstalling a sort of obviously a US-approved some dictator who was very corrupt in Yemen. He was ousted because he was corrupt, and Saudi Arabia obviously had their nose out of joint about that, and they want this particular person, this particular politician back in, because obviously that politician in Yemen who was leading the country served their purposes. And the US, of course, Saudi Arabia, who is a huge human rights abuser, is a big ally of the United States, as is the apartheid state of Israel, which is a big ally, close ally of the United States. Isn't that interesting? 3 major human rights abusers all together as allies. Just sort of, I sort of jokingly call it, but not so jokingly, the axis of evil. They like to call other countries the axis of evil. I think those 3, US empire, Saudi Arabia, and the apartheid state of Israel, are the axis of evil. Anyway, so anyway, this is what's going on in Yemen. Anyway, when I said to the presenter, that they're directly involved, the US is directly involved in this genocide, you could see this bristling, like they didn't want to sort of acknowledge that, really. They sort of obfuscated it by saying, "Oh, well, it's a very complex issue." And then later on, when I talked to a board member of SBS, who we were put onto when it got uncomfortable talking to this other woman who was supposed to be the community liaison person, and we were sort of saying to her, we find it very sort of disturbing that SBS seems to have doesn't present anything that the US is involved in, even though it's involved in everything, all this violence. It's just kind of like as if they're just there, It's not that they have any sort of part in starting it or anything. It's like they just happen to be there. Or if they don't even mention it, like they didn't mention when in relation to Yemen, they didn't mention the U.S. And so when we were speaking to the liaison officer, you could see this slight panic in her eyes. When you see in someone's eyes when they sort of are thinking. They're trying to, they're not really listening. All they're thinking about is, how can I palm these people off? She was very nice and everything, but you could see this slight panic in her eyes, looking around, thinking, how can I palm off these people who are asking me these uncomfortable questions, or making these uncomfortable statements about the US. Um, and I knew it was kind of going to be like this, and in some ways I didn't even really want to go there, because I sort of knew that I would just feel really, I knew it would upset me, because I know all the, Australia's fourth estate are really pretty much, even Four Corners now is just presenting establishment stuff. They did something on, not that Four Corners is from SBS, but they all, like the Four Corners now, it did something on China, and it didn't really, it was going along, it was on board planes and whatever, and ships of the US, and it wasn't going to be criticizing the US when it was doing this report on China, and it was all seemed to be like the Chinese are just responding in a sort of an aggressive way or something, when really the US has been taunting them and sort of doing sort of a kind of aggressive actions towards them, and has basically said that China is one of their targets now. The Pentagon has said that. And there was this whole pivot to Asia discussion a few years ago with Obama. I mean, so, it's like, that's Four Corners. It used to be sort of a good program. Gone are the days, of John Pilger type journalists. Even Sarah Ferguson, who I used to admire as, I don't know if she works for the ABC or SBS, ABC, I think. She was interviewing Hillary Clinton, who's an absolute war criminal. And Hillary Clinton was saying awful things about Julian Assange, like just defamatory stuff. And she didn't challenge it at all. And then apparently Sarah Ferguson's producer said something dreadful on Twitter, like completely ad hominem about Julian Assange on Twitter. I mean, these are, just appalling. Just appalling. And Dateline, I haven't watched Dateline for a while, but I mean, I sort of have to wonder. I notice the recent programs, they're not really, I don't know. I don't think there's much analysis of, there's so much that the US is involved in, the US empire is involved in relation to the violence in the Middle East, and also in trying to, funding opposition in Venezuela, trying to overthrow the socialist government there. Their constant meddling. This really so little. I mean, you could just dedicate an entire program. Dateline could just dedicate an entire, like one program after another, to all the meddling that the US is involved in. It could just be about that, but it's not. And really, it needs that, really, because that's how much they're involved in meddling in world affairs, international affairs, against international law, meddling in other people's countries' democratically elected governments. They do it all the time. And like programs like the Empire Files, that's actually dedicated to U.S. looking at U.S. imperialism. That pretty much the Empire Files. And you can find that at theempirefiles.tv with host Abby Martin, journalist Abby Martin. You can, they pretty much, that program is dedicated to looking at U.S. empire and its meddling, because it does so much of it. And it's responsible for the deaths of, the killing of millions of brown people overseas, in the Middle East. And it's, and destroying, democratically elected governments, and installing dictators that serve their interest. Anyway, I'm sort of getting off the track here, but it was clear after talking to the board member, seemed to have an appalling lack of information about Gaza. She actually said to me, and I could feel my blood boiling. I was actually feeling a bit angry, I have to say. It was hard for me to contain my anger, because I realized that this sort of lack of reporting they do nightly on the news is responsible for it helps protect the establishment, and it helps keep on the ignorance about these issues, which leads to the deaths of many, many people. So, excuse me. So, when I was talking to her about Gaza, this recent massacre of Palestinians, unarmed Palestinians by Israeli snipers, when they were coming up, there were 300 meters, I think, from the fence, which is an outside fence of an open-air prison, which is Gaza. I mean, Gaza is an open-air prison. I'm not even sure this board member, who's supposed to, who I was referred on to by this slightly panicked liaison officer, she was supposed to be the one to deal with our questions. I won't say her name, but her initials were DK. Anyway, this particular board member said to me, and when she said, I felt like that killing, I felt like that was, quote unquote, an excessive response, to the killing of, I think it was 130 Palestinians, and injuring over 10,000 Palestinians with live bullets and with tear gas canisters. A lot of people were shot, but not killed. That was, her words were excessive force. Now, these were unarmed Palestinians. And she said, I saw, footage of stuff, and I was thinking, did you? Like, who was showing you the footage? Because the Israeli occupational snipers on the other side of the fence, it's not a border, by the way, it's a fence of an open-air prison, they weren't taking any footage. So what footage was she seeing that she thought was showing violence from Palestinians? And by the way, there's quite a distance between where the Palestinians were and the fence where the Israeli snipers were. So at most they were throwing rocks, and there may have been some Molotov cocktails, I don't know, but they didn't get anywhere near. Rock throwing is a traditional thing that because that's all they can really do. They don't have arms really. That's all the Palestinians do. It's like an unarmed act of resistance. There was no Hamas anywhere. It was just thousands and thousands of peaceful Palestinian protesters being killed by snipers. And by the way, 500 Palestinians were shot in the head. Not all of them died, but 500 Palestinians had head wounds. Now, this particular board member, whom we were talking to, she, when I said to her, these were unarmed, and she said, but I saw footage of, when they were, I did it, and I said, how is it acceptable in any sense, to be killing and shooting with live ammunition, with snipers, with telescopes on their rifles, unarmed protesters protesting the right of return to their land, but also to end the blockade and just to have basic human rights like other people in the apartheid state of Israel, they want just human rights. They want to be able to be safe in their homes. They don't want their homes bulldozed. There's been 100 or more UN resolutions against these illegal Israeli settlements where they just go in and bulldoze Palestinian homes and bulldoze their olive trees, old ancient olive trees. They do that. They bulldoze their homes and then build on top of them. They leave a little note. It's not uncommon for them to, if people are lucky, if Palestinians are lucky, they leave a little note under a rock in front of their home, if it blows away too bad, saying that they're going to basically take over their area. And that's what a lot of the protests in Nabi Saleh, where Ahed Tamimi hails from, and her family, who protest every week the apartheid state of Israel against, they protest that. They protest the illegal Israeli settlements, the settlers, who are very violent and openly genocidally racist. And, they are just going in and bulldozing whole villages and building on top of it. It's outrageous, and this is against many, like 100 or more UN resolutions against that. So, but anyway, I said to her, how is killing unarmed protesters, quote unquote, excessive force? It's not, it's outrageous. It's like, it's beyond, like, when is that ever acceptable to do that? And, this is the thing. We have this, and that's when, I just sort of saw very clearly that she has a bias, a major bias, and she wasn't even aware that there was the killing in 2014, in mid 2014, under Operation Protective Edge by the Israeli government and Israeli occupation forces. They bombed Gaza for weeks, and they killed, I think it was over 2,000 adults and 500 plus children. They killed so many children through these bombs that they had to start putting babies and toddlers, the bodies of them, in shops, in the freezer sections of the shops, because they'd run out of spaces in the morgue. So you saw little dead children wrapped up in freezer, in sort of shops, in freezer sections. Now, can you imagine that? And this is the interesting thing I was saying to my partner just recently. This is sort of like the sort of things that we do to these other countries, like where brown and black people are. It's like it's seen as a sort of it's normalized. It's seen as sort of like acceptable. In the West, most of us don't really get outraged at this sort of thing. And yet, if this was happening to us here, in, say, Australia or in the United States, you would hear about it everywhere. People would be outraged. I mean, look at what happened after and this is the ally Saudi Arabia, take most of the people from in that bombing of, in that plane attack or whatever it was on 9/11 was done mostly by Saudis, and this is supposed to be the ally of the United States. Look at what happened after those 9/11, after 9/11 and those buildings came down. I mean, all hell broke loose, and you still don't hear the end of it. I mean, it's terrible that happened to those people. It's really awful. But I mean, there's a lot of questions, a lot of questions about that still go unanswered and probably never will. It might come out in 50 or 100 years if our species is still around. But, it's basically, I won't go into it. But anyway, there's plenty of stuff online about 9/11 and how the government, how many problems there were with the report. There's a lot of information, so I won't go into it here. But anyway, look at the hell that broke loose after 9/11. But there's a 9/11 happening every day in these Middle Eastern countries and elsewhere. Look at the havoc that the U.S. empire has caused in Latin America and has been trying to overthrow the Venezuelan government. They've been trying to meddle in that country and basically install dictators, and have been successful on occasions. And look at Honduras and Colombia. What a dreadful state they're in. And look at Venezuela, how they're trying to do everything they can to get rid of the socialist government there, even though they have more transparent elections in Venezuela than the U.S., much more. And yet all you hear is how they aren't transparent, that they're just that Maduro is a dictator, and that that the government has to go, and that the opposition. I mean, the opposition. They're funding the opposition, and the opposition is responsible for a lot of the violence that's happening there, the guerrillas, and you can see that in the Empire Files. Abby Martin did some excellent reporting from Venezuela, and I'll leave some links to that, or you can just go to the Empire Files and the empirefiles.tv and check out the many reports she's done in Venezuela. Anyway, going to going to this event and just kind of having my expectations confirmed in a way was sort of really depressing, but also having to talk to somebody who obviously has a strong Israel bias and didn't even know about the Protective Edge massacre in 2014. She sort of said to me, "Oh, I haven't heard about that." And she said, and basically looked as if she didn't believe me. I don't think she even believed what I was saying to her about she didn't believe to me what I was saying to her about these attacks, about these children being killed. And I thought, oh my God, this woman doesn't really know much about this issue at all. Why was I put onto her? And but I think that's the case. I think that, and she told me that she gets her news from Al Jazeera and the BBC and these other listed. She said she gets her news from about 20 different sources. And I was thinking, 97% of the sources that people get their news from now is just rubbish. It's just propaganda. It's establishment rubbish. So I was thinking, I was thinking she's probably gotten her news from all these establishment rags. Bought into the Hasbara sort of narrative of that that in some ways Palestinians deserve it, that they're violent, and that she doesn't even seem to understand why they were protesting. And I don't even think she knew that Gaza is like an open-air prison. Even mainstream people, even people like, say, Bill Clinton, have described it as an outdoor prison. I think somebody, anyway, people that are just everyday people, they're not left people at all, they just, have described it as that. And when she said, I don't think she believed me about those children being killed in the 2014 Protective Edge assault on Gaza. So anyway, these are the people that are the gatekeepers of information in Australia. Isn't that scary? Isn't that frightening? I mean, I knew that anyway, but it's like when you sort of face to face with someone and I think, good heavens, I know a lot more about this issue than she does, and she's probably making a couple of $100,000 a year. I don't know how much these board members make on SBS, but I think they make a pretty good salary. And, these people are responsible for getting information out to the Australian public, and they won't even mention the US when they talk about the genocide in Yemen. And please get this. This was really scary. And when I used the word genocide to her, she said, oh, SBS, we don't, SBS Australia, we don't use the word genocide. And I said, why don't you? And because that's what it is. It has all the markers of a genocide, in Yemen. She said, oh, no, because that would turn people off. That would be seen as extremist. So now, and also she said, oh, and we only have a short period of time on the news to get, across these complex issues. And I said, what is so complex about saying the US and Saudi Arabia are involved in a genocide in Yemen? That's a fact. That's not a conspiratorial thing. If you look at the details and on-the-ground reporting and stuff, and if you look at real sources of journalism, that's what's happening. They are involved. They're fueling planes in the air. They're on the ground. Marines are on the ground, the US. They're helping Saudi pilots find their targets. They're directly involved. They're not just backing it. They're directly involved in it. That's a fact. And I said, what is the, of course, I'm speaking more eloquently now than I was. I was so kind of gobsmacked and sort of mortified at her sort of apparent ignorance about some of this, and also her comments about Gaza and this excessive force thing. I was a little bit, I was feeling angry. So it's very rare for me to actually feel angry except when I sort of feel like there are gatekeepers of information. You know, when I see people sort of, and particularly when I think they know actually, or they would rather not know too much. They'd rather just say present what the BBC presents. And that's one of their trusted sources, by the way. This is the other thing that was really disturbing. Is the board, the head of the head of the department, who seemed like a very nice man. I'm not saying any of these people are, you know, they're not evil or anything, but I mean, this, you know, the guy was a very nice man. He talked to us in the beginning, but he actually said, you know, he mentioned one of their, you know, they say they don't provide opinion on SBS News Australia. They just present the truth, the facts. And then said, you know, one of their news sources was the BBC. Oh my God, you know, the BBC. I mean, they're horrifying in their presentations of they're so establishment and so sort of backing up US empire and backing up, I mean, the UK government the biggest seller of arms to one of the biggest seller of arms to Saudi Arabia is the UK government and Theresa May. And her husband, I think, has some sort of profiting angle in relation to this. You know, and Canada is selling arms to Saudi Arabia. And the US is selling hundreds of billions of dollars of arms to Saudi Arabia. And this is all, so we're all complicit in this genocide that's happening right now in Yemen. I mean, you know, and so, you know, when the department head of the news said one of their sources is the BBC, I thought, oh, whoa, you know, it's frightening. So, you know, I mean, I don't know, maybe somebody can tell me if there's anybody in any journalist, like, apart from John Pilger and Julian Assange, are there any other journalists in Australia that are reporting anything about US empire and the tremendous destruction they're causing today? Please leave some, you know, comments in the comment section if you know of any journalists that are really doing that have any traction. I mean, I'm sure there are people around who are doing that in Australia, but do they have any sort of audience, you know, for that? A real audience, because these are the mainstream shows. SBS, ABC has lost the plot. Yeah, the ABC, I mean, Four Corners has lost the plot. It's just promoting establishment stuff, really, when it talks about anything related to the US. It's not really giving a real story anymore, I don't think. That China report was awful. And I thought, oh my goodness, if that's their angle on what's happening with China in the South China Sea, then, you know, there's probably not much point in watching it anymore. And Four Corners, I used to love Four Corners. And I don't know about Dateline. I don't know. I don't know what they're doing now. I would be surprised, though, if they're actually holding US accountable for anything. I don't know. Maybe you can point out some programs if you know of any. But I mean, they're not that. The Dateline is not the sort of thing that people generally watch. You know, most of the public just watch the nightly news. Most people I know, just the general public, that's what they watch. And if they watch the Murdoch press, which is, you know, the other stations, the main stations, or Sky News, or, you know, most of what you see in Australia is Murdoch, Rupert Murdoch. And he's just a right-wing, you know, he's just a right-wing conservative that hates poor people, pretty much. That's my, you know, that's how I've seen his comments on Twitter and stuff. You know, he has contempt for the disenfranchised, it would seem. So, you know, and then you've got SBS funded by the government, and they're obviously afraid to criticize the US or Israel. And, you know, and I just sort of think to myself, you know, if these sort of things, this is what disturbs me. Apart from the fact that it disturbs me that SBS has also said the news people, said to me that, they basically almost indicated that the public has a short attention span, so they have a short time to give them information. But as I said, you can easily say the US is involved in something if it is, which it is, right? But then, sort of she'd go, oh, but it's very nuanced. No, it's not nuanced. If it's a fact, it's a fact, And then, what was it? I've lost my train of thought. But not being able to admit to the public because, that something is a genocide, because that's going to be seen as extremist. If it is a genocide, then you call it that. They say, oh, we never use that word. I mean, oh my God. And she also said if we want to, introduce the public to a, sort of a more nuanced idea, we'll sort of make sort of short kind of like movies about it. Like they did one about the overthrow of the Shah in Iran, a movie. Like as if people are too stupid to accept information. I mean, like they're sort of treating the public like, and I don't know if this is just an excuse so they don't have to actually say what's happening, but treating the public like dumbed down. It's dumbed down information. But in many ways, what that really is saying is we just don't want to sort of talk about the source of a lot of this that's going on. We don't want to talk about the real problem, which is Western imperialism and white supremacy. That's what a lot of this is about. And we need to start talking about that, white supremacist wars, because that's what a lot of it's about. And, and I have to ask myself, we seem to have, as I said, this total different set of ways of reacting to the violence to brown people in the Middle East that we would and do to when there's violence towards Western countries, like what happened 9/11 or attacks in France or whatever. We become sort of appalled, like the attack that happened, like when things happen, just in Western countries. We have a totally different way of reacting to that, the public as well as the mainstream media. And yet these sort of 9/11 events happen all the time, and people are being separated from their families. This is happening all the time through Western imperialism in Iraq and all these countries. In the Middle East, and we have this. It's almost like it's normalized. It's like it's acceptable, and we don't think of these people as real people that have real feelings, because if we did, we would be outraged. We would be totally outraged, and we would be calling for, and everybody would be calling for an end to it. Or we are deeply racist and we don't care. We've otherized these people to the point where we don't care, and we don't see them as human, that have feelings and have families, and their whole towns and countries are being destroyed, and their beautiful buildings, like in Yemen, and ancient sites are being destroyed. Their whole culture is being swept up in violence, and and their children are traumatized and psychologically scarred, and they have to carry on, sort of dealing with this constant violence. It's sort of like and if this were happening in Western countries, we would not tolerate it. And yet we tolerate this happening in these countries to brown people and black people because we're responsible in a way, and we're benefiting from this Western imperialism. We're benefiting with the resources and the dominance, the hegemony, which is what the US empire is they're trying to get full spectrum dominance. And we in Australia and in Canada and all these Western countries are benefiting from. And so I get so angry when I talk to gatekeepers of information, because the public is so dumbed down in Australia. Most of them. Most of them, all they get is the 97% of information that is complete just propaganda and leaves out anything that's real and just tells us what the government wants us to think and tells us, what corporations want us to think. That's all mostly we get in Australia. And that's the same in the United States. I mean, look at the mainstream media there. It's frightening how crazy they are, like Rachel Maddow and all these other mainstream news things. I mean, it's just like watching a sort of some wacko TV show, watching the news. And it's not just Fox News, they're all wacko. So anyway, I knew, I'm just going to wrap this up now, but I knew it was going to upset me if we raised that. I almost didn't. It was actually my partner that raised it, but I was almost thinking, is it worthwhile even bringing this up in this community thing? And I thought, if I do bring it up, it'll be for the benefit of people that are sitting in the audience. It won't be for the people on stage, because I know they'll be doing flat catching type stuff, and they'll be trying to, obfuscate and sort of explain away and whatever, like they did. They did that later on after the, when we went out to have a drink and in the, when they had a little break. But, I sort of knew it was going to be like that. But I thought to myself, if I'm going to raise it, it's going to be for the audience's benefit, to see what they actually say, and anyway, anyway, I sort of felt quite angry inside, because these are the gatekeepers of information in Australia, and we're so dumbed down here now that I don't think people think probably that Russia is controlling, information, or meddling with election. Who knows? It's just sort of it's just a sad state of affairs. The fourth estate in Australia is just a mess. It's just useless. It's worse than useless. It's dangerous, and I don't know. We don't even have anything really that I'm aware of. Maybe we do. We don't have anything even like the Real News Network or Democracy Now, and even Democracy Now it was promoting regime change, I think, in Syria and even in Libya, I think. And look at Libya now. It's a destroyed country with slavery. People are being sold as slaves in Libya. That's an example of Western intervention, and their leader being mutilated and killed. A bayonet stuck up his rectum and killed. I mean, how appalling. We came, we saw, he died. That's what Hillary Clinton said. Can you imagine if that was done? If say, United States was bombed to bejesus, and then their various leaders in their states were taken out and mutilated in public and killed, and then the United States returned to slavery again, with people being sold as slaves. I mean, that's what's happened to Libya. And that's because of the United States meddling and bombing and regime change. All because Gaddafi didn't really want to submit to U.S. empire, and that's what it's all about. If your country doesn't submit to U.S. empire, then you're in deep shit, in one way or another. I mean, in fact, I've mentioned this before, even in my own country, the CIA admitted that they helped overthrow Gough Whitlam, who was a Democratic Socialist Prime Minister. They did that in 1975, and he was probably the best Prime Minister we ever had. And they got rid of him, and it's been a neoliberal mess ever since. So I know directly what it's like for the CIA to meddle in my own government's affairs and to end up taking out one of the best Prime Ministers we ever had, a Democratic Socialist Prime Minister, and now we've had a neoliberal mess ever since. And we're heading gradually toward what the US is heading toward, with, taking away death by 1,000 cuts with Medicare and all that kind of thing. We've got a really full-on right-wing conservative government in at the present time, and we have a very weak opposition, and even the other third parties is kind of a weak opposition too. So our democracy is just gradually, dripping away, really. It's just bleeding, hemorrhaging away. And the fourth estate is dead, really, pretty much here. So that's the state of affairs of our so-called democracy in Australia. And if you don't have a healthy fourth estate that is supposed to hold the government's feet to the fire, then you don't have a democracy. So I don't even consider Australia in many ways a democracy, because our fourth estate does not hold the government's feet to the fire at all. Anyway, that's really all I wanted to say. So anyhow, SBS is just like all the others, really. Probably they have some very valuable programs in relation to multiculturalism. I think they're really great in that way. So I don't write them off entirely, but I would never use them as a news source. And of course, I didn't need to speak to them to know that anyway. I already gathered that just from glancing at their pages and what they focus on. But, that's the state of affairs in Australia. Anyhow, so you might want to, if you live in Australia, or even if you don't, put a hashtag SBS in Tassie. Just put hashtag SBS INTASSIE. And if you put that and then put, I would like, something to the effect of, I would like to see SBS News critique U.S. imperialism, and just and if they'll be looking for that hashtag, and if they get some people saying that, maybe they'll see. Maybe they probably won't take it on, but I mean, at least it's a critique, because they don't do it. So consider that hashtag, and they need to, at the very least, we have to at least criticize these programs and give them a little bit of a conscience prick about what the hell they're doing, because this sort of propaganda, this sort of lack or deception by omission, by leaving out things like the US, when you talk about Middle Eastern wars and destruction, when you leave them out of that conversation, and or you pretend like they're just there for humanitarian reasons, in quotes, or whatever the hell. When you present it like that, you're helping U.S. empire, you're helping the establishment with its propaganda, basically, which in turn helps kill millions of brown people in those countries and destroys countries. So it's no small potatoes. Anyway, thanks very much for watching. I didn't mean to talk this long. I'm a bit of a rambler sometimes, aren't I? Anyway, thanks so much for watching. My name's Trish Roberts. Please subscribe to my channel. It's at Vegantrove, VEGANTROVE. And please click the little bell that gives you notifications. Otherwise, if I upload something or go live, you probably won't get that notification. And I hope that you will, subscribe if you wish. And also you can join Real Progressives. I do live streams there. I usually do, I do live streams on anti-imperialism, anti-war, and veganism. Veganism is very, very important to me. I haven't talked about it in this particular live stream, but if you're not vegan, please consider going vegan, because we're all interconnected. And what we do to the most vulnerable on the planet, which is non-human animals, we will do to human animals. And that's the case. You can see it all the time. You see it in Gaza. You see it in Yemen. You see it all over the place. They're the most vulnerable group. We don't need animal products at all to survive. We can easily meet all our nutrition requirements from plants and other non-animal sources. So there's no good reason for us to be killing 1 trillion torturing and killing 1 trillion land and aquatic animals plus every year. There's no reason whatsoever. And it's destroying our health, and it's destroying the planet. So look up The Guardian's article called Avoiding Meat and Dairy is the Single Most Important Thing You Can Do to Address Climate Change. I think that's the title. I'll put a link to that in the information section. And that's a staggering figures on why animal agriculture is destroying the environment. And it's sort of, being vegan, eating a plant-based diet, which is not veganism, but I'm just saying the diet in itself is incredibly beneficial. in all sorts of ways and health ways. The most important reason, though, to be vegan is because non-human animals are not our resources. Anyway, so that's my little spiel about veganism, which is so important. I try to include it in every live stream because it is very important. Okay, thanks so much for watching. My name is Trish Roberts. You're watching Faint Signals from Vega. Till next time, bye for now.